My friends, this is 3 sermons crammed into one short burst. Therefore, I will not take a whole lot of time unpacking some of the stuff or sourcing it. If you want to form a group and study or talk more about these ideas, I would be excited to do so. There's a lot here. The sermon today will basically be in 4 parts, some context and some breaking down of myths, talking specifically about what defund the police is and is not, talking a bit about why defunding the police is reasonable and practical in the 21st century here, and then how our UU principles inform our conversation and decisions. So we'll start with some context and some myth busting. One of the things I hear that defund the police is a dangerous idea from Black Lives Matter. The concept has been around since 1988, actually, and Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi created the hashtag Black Lives Matter in 2013, 25 years after the defund the police idea was first stated. After Trayvon Martin's murder was acquitted is when Black Lives Matter came into vogue. So it's not the same thing. Black Lives Matter and Antifa are terrorist organizations working together to destabilize the country. Black Lives Matter is a slogan. It was a hashtag, as I just said, used by the Movement for Black Lives. Now, lots of people, including myself, use those two things interchangeably, the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. Strictly speaking, it is Movement for Black Lives, and the Movement for Black Lives does not call for violence. They are not terrorists. Caveat, turns out Black people are not monolithic. They have different ideas among them, just like all human beings do. Some people of color probably do want violence. Others want to preserve the racist status quo because it's working for them. There are a variety of approaches in the world. But in general, the Movement for Black Lives does not call for violence. The Movement for Black Lives is actually a little bit like the Black Panthers. Yes, they did pose with rifles here and there. Mostly what they did was political work and outreach. They cooked breakfasts for children. Look up the Movement for Black Lives website, and you can see their actual policies there. m4bl.org/policy-platforms. Google it. You can find it. They make it easy. You can also look more locally. The South Bend chapter of Black Lives Matter on their Facebook page has 7 pillars of justice that they're working on in our community, including such radical ideas as housing, education, and lead abatement. Now, a lot of the violence that we see on television or on the internet is perpetrated by opportunists, folks of all races who just want to blow off steam. Often it's white agitators pretending to be Black Lives Matter supporters and therefore cause more trouble and agitate for more violence. One thing we know is that in Minneapolis, one of the people who was breaking the windows was an off-duty cop. Don't just assume everyone that says they're Black Lives Matter are in fact with the organization. And while we're talking about this, let's also mention that violence is a loaded term in this situation. Breaking bank windows is considered violence, but destroying tents of unhoused people is not. And the Department of Homeland Security refers to graffiti as violence. It might be a crime. It's not violence. Take a step back from some of this overheated rhetoric, shall we? And just one more thing about Antifa. It's not an organization. There is no central structure. Unlike the Movement for Black Lives, they don't have any kind of stated goals or overarching plan. They're just a bunch of people who don't believe that fascists should be allowed to take over our government. You may recall some of the most famous Antifa people in the world, the troops on Normandy Beach and Woody Guthrie. That's Antifa, regardless of what some television programs tell you. Now, a big thing we have to unpack is that the majority of cops are good. There are just a few bad apples. There are absolutely good law enforcement officers doing their best to make our world safer, and I applaud those folks. And there are a lot of cops who are unrepentant racists. It's a shocking percentage of the number of cops who are on racist Facebook groups and post racist memes. Some of them in particular are ghost skins, racist skinheads who deliberately infiltrate law enforcement. The FBI has been monitoring this for 15 years now. It is a significant issue in our world. And it's simply the case that many cops are violent bullies. In addition to the many, many videos we've seen of them killing unarmed people, just in the last month, we're in late July now, 2 months, cops in Columbus, Ohio maced a double amputee and took his artificial legs. Detroit police rammed an SUV into protesters. Police in several cities shooting at members of the press. Police officers in Asheville, North Carolina, beating street medics who had been treating an injured person. That's against the Geneva Convention, even in wartime. And our law enforcement officials are doing it now. Worse, this is how they act when they know they're being filmed. Imagine what they do when they're sure they're not being held accountable. Now, my Black, Indigenous, and people of color friends will point out this is how they've always treated us. They're just doing it to white folks, and we're just getting it caught on film now. And perhaps even more dismaying in some ways, some police are outright traitorous. During some of the demonstrations after George Floyd was killed in May, the Cincinnati police hoisted the thin blue line police flag on the flagpole outside the Hamilton County Justice Center, which is usually our American flag. They say it had been taken down already. Regardless, hoisting the police flag in place of our nation's flag is concerning. And all that stuff's about individuals. The real point here is not about a few bad apples. It's about the systemic racism built into our institutions. Our police departments are functioning as they were intended. 200 years ago, the 13 colonies had two basic models of policing. Imported from England was the volunteer watch model, where every male person above a certain age had to spend one night wandering the streets, taking care to make sure everyone was safe and raising the alarm if things were going awry. So there was a volunteer model, and there was the professional slave patrols whose job was to bring back the slaves who had escaped. Our model of policing comes from those slave patrols. Keeping the peace has always meant keeping poor folks out of rich neighborhoods and keeping the races segregated. Even if 98% of the police officers were model citizens, the system is racist, violent, and problematic. And that brings us to what defund the police is and is not. Defunding the police is not a magic bullet which will solve racism. We must change all of society and ourselves to make this work. Defunding the police is not abolishing the police. Now, some people do want that, but they're very clear about it, and they use the word abolish. They don't use defund if they mean abolish. Now, I've just talked about the whole system being rotten to the core, and we do need to maybe have some kind of new start. Seems to me it's always going to have to be piecemeal and occur in stages. We're not going to abolish the police and start over at midnight on a certain day. It's going to take some effort, and it's going to be done over time. Defunding the police is not about allowing anarchy or unchecked violence. Virtually everyone in this conversation appreciates that we need professional law enforcement officers to handle murder and other heinous crimes. Defund the police is not meant as an attack on underpaid professionals who do an extremely dangerous job. It's not an attack at all. In fact, we'll see that we're hoping to help those very police officers. And most cops are actually pretty well paid and they have very generous pensions. And police work is not even in the top 10 of most dangerous jobs. Construction workers, roofers, pilots, landscape workers, truck drivers all have more deaths per 100,000 workers. I'm not saying that police work is not dangerous. I'm saying that many people perform work which is more dangerous, and they don't use that as an excuse to maim and kill other people without accountability. Defund the Police is about accountability. In Manhattan, a police officer punched a man in the face, and then the DA charged the man who had been punched felony assault on the police officer because the cop's knuckles swelled up after they punched them. And the cop who shot unarmed social worker Charles Kinsey as he lay flat on the ground was acquitted of attempted manslaughter and instead sentenced to writing a 2,500-word essay on why shooting people is bad. Incidents like these do not make our society safer. Incidents like these embolden the cops to be more violent because they know they get away with it. We need accountability. How many of you heard the story about McMuffin Cop? Some of us. Now, McMuffin Cop is not Starbucks Cop nor Shake Shack Bleach Cops, all of whom were caught lying about their experiences. McMuffin Cop was a woman officer who filmed herself freaking out at a McDonald's drive-thru. The restaurant workers had made a mistake. It was taking a admittedly long time. This police officer was certain they were trying to poison her. She had a bit of a meltdown on camera. Soon thereafter, journalist Soledad O'Brien tweeted, "I feel sorry for McMuffin Cop because she is a human being who is stressed, exhausted, paranoid, and overwhelmed." O'Brien continued, "I feel sorrier for the people in the community where she works because she is paranoid and armed and could kill someone and never be held responsible." Many law enforcement officers have it down to a science. They know to shout, "Stop resisting," even when people are not resisting. And they know that saying in court, "I was afraid for my life," gives them a free pass to shoot to kill. I absolutely believe that our law enforcement officers are stressed out. I see that McMuffin Cop and many others are truly terrified that people are out to get them. It is clear that they see any black skin as threatening. Even black children holding water guns appear so dangerous that police immediately start shooting. Partially, this is due to qualified immunity, which gives most police immunity for things done on the job which would otherwise be serious crimes. Our U.S. House of Representatives has introduced a bill to end or at least curtail qualified immunity. We'll see where that goes. It's also why our community, those of us in St. Joseph County, including and especially the South Bend Black Lives Matter chapter, advocated for a better discipline matrix for our South Bend Police Department. We want consistency, transparency, and accountability in our police forces. Defund the Police is about accountability. It's also about redirecting resources. That's local resources, spending tons of money to have police in schools and colleges, which could be better spent elsewhere. It also includes spending money on police officers requiring them to do things for which they are not trained. Let's spend less money on people who are trained to handle mental health, addictions, and intimate partner disputes. It's also about redirecting military resources. The vast majority of local police departments get surplus military technology, and when you're a hammer, too many situations look like a nail. There are peer-reviewed studies that show when you give people that kind of technology, they're going to use it, and they're going to do harm. Why is defunding the police both reasonable and practical? It's economically sensible. It makes sense. It shrinks the scope of their work. It focuses more tightly on the things that they do well. It offers more training for specifics and uses others' existing professionals to handle mental health and domestic disputes. In any other business, this would be an easy decision. Plus, a lot of police budgets are huge, and they cost gigantic amounts in settlements to people who were tortured, shot, and otherwise mistreated. Defunding the police could save money and make better progress toward our goals of a safe and fair society. It should be a no-brainer. So why is defunding the police so controversial? Here's what I think, and this part of this piece is only my opinion, but it seems accurate. You tell me later. People in these United States have more guns and commit more violence than most any other country in the world. Researchers and pundits ask why, as if they didn't already know that our entire society still imagines it's a plantation in the Deep South in the late 19th century. If my childhood issues keep coming up in my therapy sessions, then it makes sense that our nation's original sins continue to plague our efforts to do better as a society. I think that a large percentage of white U.S. citizens thinks that they need militarized police departments and multiple guns in their own homes because they're terrified of an eventual uprising from the people who have been enslaved and oppressed for generations. If we as a nation let go of this fear, which means if we do the work to overcome our internal and institutional racism, if we conquer our fear, then reallocating resources and using other professionals to do the work they're trained to do is an easy, obvious decision. Then the situation becomes a bit like the Freedom House ambulance service. We couldn't imagine a different way of doing things until we did. And in fact, we have already been imagining different solutions. Harvard professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad, we have solutions. Community-based public health responses to violence and harm in the community are proven effective strategies that help communities resolve conflict without perpetuating violence. The police are not necessary. They're not required. Let go of your vision that police are the only answer. This is not a problem that requires more policing, end quote. And I know it's practical because cities are doing it now and have been doing it for years, but most particular in the last few months, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, St. Petersburg, Florida, Halifax, Nova Scotia have all passed legislation to spend less on police and more on other professionals. It can be made to work. Another important piece in all this is public understanding and will. Unlike in 1988, when the phrase defund the police sounded really radical, our populace is coming to agree and understand. According to a recent Slate.com article, when white Americans are asked whether the police, quote, have made the changes needed to treat blacks equally or, quote, need to continue making changes, excuse me, 80% say more change is needed. 70% say in encounters with police, white people are treated more fairly than black people. On other questions, the shift hasn't yet produced a majority, but it has reversed the balance of power. A plurality of white respondents now say police officers in dangerous situations are more likely to use excessive force against black people than against white people. A plurality also says it's okay for NFL players to kneel during the national anthem to protest police killings of African Americans, end quote. Now, how does my Unitarian Universalist faith inform this conversation? How do our UU principles inform our conversation? Just a couple of weeks ago, we held our Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly. Because it was all virtual and people didn't have to leave work nor pay for travel or hotel expenses, we had the third largest registration ever. Just under 5,000 people attended our General Assembly. Those people from all over the country passed actions of immediate witness to defund the police, to abolish ICE, the Immigrations and Custom Enforcement arm, and to ask congregations to find good alternatives instead of calling the police. So those statements are how 5,000 of our UU siblings and cousins interpret our UU principles. Let's get a little more specific. According to our first principle, we covenant together to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Every person. Every person means every police officer, every person chanting Black Lives Matter, everybody on the streets protesting, and every family member who posts racist things on Facebook. Now, we do not have to agree with everyone, and we can certainly call attention when their words or actions are harmful, and we are called to do so without demonizing them. Our seventh principle suggests similar conclusions. We are all part of the interdependent web of life. We cannot thrive if the rest of the web does not also thrive. There are no others. We cannot truly speak of them. We are only us. We cannot say that the problems of migrant workers or unhoused persons or Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are not of deep concern to us. Nor can we say that the issues faced by police officers, small business owners, people who attend conservative religious services are not also important to us. We have to work toward wholeness and equity in all of these situations. And that brings us to the last principle that we'll mention this morning, our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The most important part of this principle may be in the last two words, for all. In the words of activist Fannie Lou Hamer, nobody's free until everybody's free. I hear the call of the social gospel here. We must work to liberate everyone, and we must pay special attention, do extra labor to liberate those who are most harmed or most marginalized. Let us return to the words of Soledad O'Brien. I feel sorry for McMuffin Cop because she is a human being who is stressed, exhausted, and overwhelmed. We absolutely must care for our police officers. In fact, defunding the police and reducing the unwieldy scope of their jobs could be a kindness to these stressed out and overwhelmed members of society. And the rest of O'Brien's tweet, I feel sorrier for the people in the community where she works because she is paranoid and armed and could kill someone and never be held responsible. We must take even greater care for the people who are routinely harassed, arrested, tortured, and killed because of the color of their skin. Let us explore other ways of making our communities safe and healthy. In many situations, compassionate words and a little firm guidance can be much more effective than a gun. Partially defunding the police, reallocating those resources, making the whole system more transparent and accountable will someday be seen as the obvious and inevitable conclusion for a peaceful and just society. So may we be.